Welcome to the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. I'm your host, Kate Powell. In a world where humans who feel vibrant, whole, and fully alive seem to be increasingly rare, where burnout and brokenness seem to be increasingly the norm, both in individuals and our larger ecosystems, it seems worth exploring how did we get here? And more importantly, what perspectives or what cultural practices or what spiritual, ancestral, or animist wisdom processes might help us stay true to the spark and rhythm of our aliveness on this wild, heartbreaking, but ultimately rare and precious life. Thank you for being here. May these conversations help us to stay human in the face of dehumanizing forces. May they nourish our wild, tender hearts, and may they plant seeds which flourish into a more regenerative and vibrant future. Hi, Kate here with Wild Sacred Journey. And recording a podcast episode with a guest, Tamy. Is it Roloff? I actually forgot to check with you. Okay.
Yeah.
Wasn't sure how to pronounce it. Yeah. Wanted to make sure I got that right. So yeah, I'm here with Tamy today, and I'm really excited because I think we'll be talking some about aging and aliveness, and being human and a lot of different things. And so I'm excited to see where our conversation goes. But I'll read you Tammy's bio as she wrote it. Well, actually, before we dive into that, I'll still light our candle so that we kind of have a sense of gathering around fire, which is something our ancestors have done, something that feels really deeply human. So I invite all of us to just kind of take a few breaths and just kind of land in together. And so Tamy says, I am the owner and president of Holistic Woman, where I retail and wholesale medicinal herbal teas and provide women's health and healing coaching, as well as executive and positive organization coaching. This brings together my years of herbal tea making and customer education in our family organic market, my decades of listening, loving, and supporting women in my midwifery and birth work, and my love of positive psychology and organizational leadership graduate studies. Even as a child, I was always an entrepreneur dreaming of and starting new businesses. I'm the mother of 4 beautiful grown-ups and the grandmother of 15, 9 of which I was given the honor to midwife into the world. I've created a joyful, safe, and sustainable life with my 3 dogs, beautiful friends and family, and a yard I am slowly regenerating into a food forest. So that's all. That is a beautiful life story in a very small nutshell. So welcome, Tamy. Thanks for being here. Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
And thank you very much. I'm just feeling my bones, my ischial tuberosities sitting on this chair, and wet side feels like it's touching the most, and my feet on the ground. Karen Strange, a beautiful woman who, if you ever have the opportunity to listen to her, read any of her work, she's talks about babies being born and the experience that babies have being born. And with it, she brings a lot of body work and suggestions to the birth worker to make those experiences for the baby, especially one who's having a hard time coming into the world, making it better for them by how the practitioner is able to meet the trauma or the experience. And I'm not that this is trauma, but just letting myself relax here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. There are 2 things that sprung up to me as you were saying that. One, how much one of my main teachers, when I went through my yoga teacher training, he always would remind us, like, who you are when you teach is what you're teaching. So like you could call whatever pose you can go, but at the end of the day, people are going to leave that class and they're going to remember how you left them feeling. And that's mostly not out of your doing, it's out of your presence, and then in my energetic medicine training, my teachers would always say, presence is primary, presence is primary. So it's the how we're being in, and how we're positioning ourselves within ourselves when we're relating that has the most impact, because our nervous systems are so co-attuned, like they're designed for that, and I remember hearing too that how we enter the world is one of our first imprints for how we navigate transitions. Is that true for you? Have you? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I totally believe that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I found a letter actually, like that my mom had written to one of her doctors, like shortly after I was born, talking about the experience, which, because I'd asked her one time, because after I read that, I was like, I'm so curious, and she was like, honestly, I don't really remember a whole lot of it. Like, that was a long time ago. And I'm like, that's fair, you know. But I actually then, shortly after I asked that, I happened to stumble across this letter that she'd written somewhere in the house. And I was like, whoa. And or she stumbled across a whole bunch of like my baby things and kind of was like, I don't know if you're interested in any of this, like, this feels like it should be yours to decide whether you want to keep it or not, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And I was looking through the letter, and it was interesting reading about how just the rhythm of it, because it was a hospital birth, and so it was definitely more like, okay, now you're in this room, oh, okay, you're clearly far enough along, now we're going to move you to this room. But in the moving, like, then the actual process stopped, which makes sense, because
Yeah.
obviously if our hunter-gatherer ancestors, if a threat had come up and they needed to move, then the process would stop.
Yep.
And so then the
Absolutely.
doctor came in and was like frustrated because it wasn't as far along because the process had stopped. And it's funny because I definitely have always felt in my life like I was kind of out of rhythm with, like,
Oh, uh-huh.
and that I'm always a little bit behind, and I'm always a little bit like just not quite synced up with everything and everyone else. And so in reading that, I was like, well, that all makes sense.
Mhm. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
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 When I was a kid, my mom would read psychology stuff. She was a teacher, and it was still the theory of you were a blank slate when you're born, and nurture was the reason you were the way you were.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there was no there was no discussion about the effect of birth or the effect of in the prenatal period, where we know that the baby is hearing and moving around in response to stimuli. There's a really great ultrasound. It's an ad, and I think it's in Italian, and it's just an ultrasound of this baby floating around in the amniotic fluid, but you can hear the parents arguing in the background. And then you hear the dad yell really loud, and like there's a loud sound. I don't know if like something gets hit, but anyway, the baby just jumps. And the whole point is, what's happening in utero is affecting this human, this soul that's coming in and through. And yeah, and then the transition through birth, I definitely believe it is a choice we make to continue to come in or not.
Mm-hmm. 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 Mm. Yeah. That's one of the things that I think I found particularly effective about like energetic work, and more like working within the energy fields within and around the human body for reparative work. I prefer calling it that
Yeah.
sometimes to healing work, or even trauma, because I think those words have become so kind of overused and in some
Yeah.
ways misunderstood in our modern world. There's a lot of
Yeah.
memology that seems like it's taken over those words. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's, because so many people, we have these imprints, whether from pre-verbal times, prenatal times, ancestral inheritances and
Right.
epigenetics, past life stuff, collective field stuff, like that we all have some part of the collective field that we're supposed to kind of steward, in some way, whatever it is, right? It's like
Mhm.
all of that stuff, only we can't really work with that on a consciousness level and I think a lot of, because we're not conscious of it. And
Right.
so that's where I think, yeah, bringing in sort of that spiritual thread, or I imagine that, I know for me, working with plants definitely helps me tap into that. So I would imagine, I'd love to hear if you have anything you want to share about that, with your herbal medicines work. But that it's like we have to broaden our perspective beyond just our human
Yes.
consciousness. because there's this whole other layer of things that actually need tending to, because they're relevant and they get stored in the body, in the soma, and as well as then in the energetic field and in the soul blueprint, or whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised in just a regular, in the 1960s Christian family, very little, well, when I was a teenager or a young adult, I called it hypocrisy, so it's like you went to church, you supposedly followed the rules, yet my parents didn't follow the rules. And so I'm like, okay, that's not anything I want. But I went to the other extreme. I ended up joining a cult group and going that route until that no longer made sense. And then it's just really probably since my 30s, really my 40s on, that I started to take a look at the spiritual side of myself that I've known since I was little. I would talk about my experiences, and my mom, in the church brand they didn't believe in anything spiritual happening, in the spirit world happening. It was very black and white experience for them. And so my experiences that were spiritual, I had fit into the Christian box. It was like, okay, that's just God talking to me. That's just, once I learned about the Holy Spirit, that's just the Holy Spirit talking to me. And so I spent probably the last 15 to 20 years starting to recognize that this is just, again, this spiritual experience happening in a human body, that I came here to learn things. And so one of the things has been plants, and that was probably in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that I started to understand that plants had a process, that they were all placed there. So my feeling is we can now access plants from all over the world. I can go online, I can order herbs that were grown in China, Europe, Africa, wherever. But in the times where we couldn't travel the world like that, all the things we need for our healing are in our locale. We can, if we know what they are. And so I have spent a lot of time recently really getting to know the plants themselves and growing them in my yard, going places to just see them, to touch them, to experience them, so that they become friends, not just allies that are healing, that I can, order a tincture and it works. I mean, that's how I started. I just started by using them for myself and my family. But now they're alive, and they're sentient, and they're enjoyable to know. And just like you're enjoyable to get to know, they're enjoyable to get to know. And that is something I am sure my ancestors used, but I don't know any of them that did. So it's like, I truly kind of am a blank slate in that regard. So I just feel like my whole life is just learning. Like I can't die because I still have so much to learn.
That's how we stay young, right?
I think so.
Staying curious all the time. Yeah, I love what you're pointing to there, because I think for me, I feel like, it's so easy to put big words on, or big seeming words on all of that, but I think, for me, when I feel into that in my body, that's sort of like, I don't know who my ancestors were who lived in this way. I think that's something that a lot of us who in modern times we might refer to as being in white bodies, we've had the ruptures in our roots and in our ancestral lineages, and the ruptures that our ancestors experienced from their place, their language, their land. And I think humans have always been significantly more migratory than we sometimes think of them as. Like even
Yeah.
when the village was stronger, I remember last year when I was in Scotland, I was in an area, the Kilmartin Glen area, which has remnants of like 5,000-year-old
Mhm.
like ceremonial cairns built on top of like other stuff that predates even that. I mean, it's like it's going back in that area. And one of the things they did in they have a museum there that they just reopened that's really amazing, but they have a map on the wall. And on that map, they have all the places in the world that they found beadwork or pottery work that they know originated from these specific cultures. And so they were like, either there was trade somehow happening that somehow made it all the way to this like far north,
Yeah.
remote little corner of Scotland, or people, it wasn't just the objects that were migrating, it was probably the people. And in fact, it may even have been the artisans, the craftspeople, the tradespeople who were
Mhm.
making the things who actually found their way there. And so it was quite a hub for ceremonial and trade purposes. But it was amazing. I mean, it was like we tend to think of our long ago ancestors as being so primitive because we're so progress oriented and like modernity oriented somehow. We've really been trained in that way, especially again those of us kind of in the quote unquote West and
Mhm.
of European descendancy. Post enlightenment, there's kind of this whole like focus on the intellect and on
Yeah.
and in much of the church, as the church became really organized religions, they kind of moved into like, let's move away from the body and kind of bypass all of like the messiness of this and just aim for heaven.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so those two things kind of go hand in hand in a lot of ways. Um but yeah, and so there, yes, but so in all of that, where people were still paying attention to the natural world and living in more intimacy with it. And I think you're right, I believe that too, that they recognized, and I even feel that for myself, again, especially on that energetic and spiritual level. It's like yeah, I do, I recognize plants as friends. Like I'll be walking down, and even if I don't know how to like name it yet, or there's I started noticing like with mugwort. I'd started working with mugwort tea and some mugwort, and some other forms. And I kind of knew how it looked, but I hadn't like put it together. And I was like walking through a forest with somebody else on a foraging workshop actually one day. And I just had this plant that I just wanted to reach out and touch. And I was just like, I wasn't even really paying attention. We were kind of in conversation and I like had to reach out and touch it. And then I like stopped and I kind of like looked at where I was touching, and she just starts laughing and she's like, of course you would go right for the mugwort. And I was like, oh, of course, and it was like, oh yeah, there it is. But it's like, even though my conscious brain didn't recognize, oh, hey, friend, some deeper part of me was like, oh, hey, friend, and it's true. They have, and I think that's what animism is. That's what that animistic perspective is like being able to
Mhm.
say everything has a consciousness, everything has an energetic signature. And when we actually
Yeah.
start to familiarize ourselves with that, it's like walking down the road and recognizing a human friend walking towards you, and
Mhm.
um I don't know, I think that's pretty fundamental to like being human and being alive actually. And
Yeah.
um yeah, what's been your experience with that, I guess?
Well, I really agree with you. It's almost like in my family history anyway, there was kind of like a dead time, like if we're
Mm,
talking aliveness. Like so my grandparents were young and have starting their family during World War II, and they're very science oriented. So my grandma had twilight sleep. She didn't experience, she did not emotionally experience birth.
mm,
So there was the energy of birth, she was going through it, but she was not aware of it.
mm,
And, no breastfeeding
mm,
for 2 generations.
mm,
Just everything was science based. And if it
mhm,
wasn't scientific, it wasn't valid. My dad's family was a little bit different, but I didn't really have a lot of contact with them. So always felt like an outsider, like I didn't really fit in to that consciousness where they were living. Like I was always a little bit, I felt different. Once I went to Haiti in the early like 2010, and I was standing in the airport, and I was in Miami getting ready to fly over to Haiti, and I had this vision of, those dolls. Well, they're not really dolls, but the cutouts of those,
Mm-hmm. Like the
and you
chains
spread them
that,
out.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, the
yeah, yeah.
paper chains that are humans. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they're usually done in white, but this was in brown. And it just, instead of going this way, it went this way, but like I could see each one behind the other, and they had no faces, nobody I knew like visually, but they said they were my ancestors, and they told me they were proud of me, and they were glad I was going to Haiti. And that was that was very validating to me. And as I thought on it over the years, just one of the things is that, oh, my ancestors aren't just the ancestors I remember.
Yeah.
There are a lot more that I'm like than the ones that
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm not like. So,
Yeah. Mm.
yeah. And I don't really know any history, though I did do a tiny bit of kind of historical research as to where my family came from. And one of them immigrated from Scotland.
Mm.
That stood out to me. So yeah, I'd love, on my list of to-do things, are going to some of the sacred places. I actually have a book about the sacred places in the world, and that I would like to
Mm.
go and visit, because I think that energy would be really amazing to see in person, experience in person.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
about the plants themselves, going along with the science. So I have these plants, tansies, in my front yard, and they're considered I want to call them a hostile weed. That's not the right term.
Invasive.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
An invasive weed. But I
Yeah.
get a lot of hostility from the science that's in the area, feeling like, okay, I got to get these out of my yard.
Right.
So I have felt some hostility towards them. Like, why are you so invasive? Why do you grow so well? And why do you try to,
Mm.
take out my other happy herbs that I want? And I call YouTube now my mom and grandma, because my both have passed. And so if I need information,
Aw.
I go to YouTube. And I looked up tansy, and sure enough, it has a lot of, you don't want to eat it, but it has a lot of properties
Mm.
that you can appreciate and love about it. And so also changing my perspective from the science perspective of, this is invasive, we don't want it. I had been married to a farmer, so
Mm.
you had so much about, what are invasive herbs, and you got to spray them and kill them, which of course, went against my gut.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of going, oh, actually, these are good they have a purpose. They're here for
Mm.
a reason.
Mm.
And let's figure out how to use them, not just need to spray them and hate them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so I changed my relationship with some plants,
Yeah.
realizing that it was culturally um, brought upon me versus how I really feel energetically about them. Like,
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that points to something too about aliveness, in the sense that, like, one of the traps, we're talking about migration, right? And like, migration is a complicated subject right now. Like, immigration is
yeah.
a very heated topic. Refugee is a heated thing. There's a lot of this. And then, settler colonialism is there's all these like big words that we've kind of attached to these concepts that have a lot of like cultural, like you said, cultural meaning, cultural baggage kind of like
Mm-hmm.
interwoven with them. geopolitical stuff. But it's like, and it's true that there are aspects of that can be harmful, right? In the sense that, we see that where people come in with the intention of exploiting and not being relational, like the environment suffers, other humans suffer, even the people doing that actually suffer on some way, even if they're not aware of it at the time. And I think the same can happen with like plants and animals. We introduce things, we see in Australia, right? You introduce things that have no natural predator and it gets out of control very quickly.
Right.
The same with like the kudzu vine here in like the mid-Atlantic and other parts of the US, So there's a lot of, there is a certain amount of consciousness, I think, that it's beneficial for us to bring to the idea of movement and migration and bringing things that weren't native to certain places into those places, and how that affects the balance of things. But yeah, at some level it's also just aliveness happening, and an evolution actually like happening. And at what point do we get almost too like precious with it, and I saw this story recently that was about these conservationists. It was like a rare kind of albino bear, and it was like a brown or a black bear. I think it was a brown bear, but it was, it was white. It was what, native peoples, I think, would have called spirit bears. And they kept mistaking it. There was this conservationist group that kept mistaking it for a polar bear that had accidentally ended up in the wrong place. And they kept taking it and trying to put it back in the Arctic, and the poor bear, and then like the scientists up there would see it and be like, whoa, how'd this poor like white brown bear end up here? And they'd like take it back down, and this poor bear just kept getting flown back and forth between like, and it was struggling in the Arctic because that wasn't where, and it wasn't a polar bear, and the polar bears were all like, who are you? And so anyway, it's just, at what point are we like, do we also get so focused on things being right that like also becomes anti-aliveness actually? And, I think a lot of people who work more with like plant spirits, when they're working with plants, not just plants as like kind of in our more Western allopathic approach of like, symptom cure, kind of thing, but more like, what is the consciousness of this plant? What is it? We'll say that the plant shows up like to serve its purpose in some way, that there's a medicine it's trying to bring, or a consciousness it's trying to bring to the moment, so I love that, what you're demonstrating in your story about kind of that, that shifting perspective to realize like, how has my culture actually taught me to be sort of anti-aliveness in this way, or to be more combative, or to be like hostile, and then you end up escalating hostility, instead of just like, okay, this is here now, and what do we how do we work with that? And
because I would come out every day and feel annoyed at these tansies because I hadn't dug them up and got rid of them, put them in my compost, or done something with them. But
how often do we do that to ourselves too, right? Like we like expect ourselves to measure up in some way to something, and then are just like annoyed with ourselves when we aren't, instead of trusting that we're designed to be who we are in some way, Anyway, what were you going to say? Yeah.
Oh, my dog's barking. Can you hear my dog barking?
No, actually. I think, yeah.
Good.
I heard maybe a little bit of it, but not,
so I was going to say, just in light of the kudzu, you were talking about things not having predators or being brought into an area where where they start overgrowing the native plants. If we taught one another how to use the plant, so like kudzu has lots of great benefits. I mean, we're as humans, we are the best predators of, killing.
We've elevated that to an art form. Yeah, we sure have.
And if everybody in the area knew how you could use kudzu to benefit their families, then would it have gotten so out of control and overgrown in the way that it has? I don't know. That's just a question that I have about my tansy. I'm going to use it to make some insect repellent and try it out and appreciate its gift, what it's here and can gift. And it's pretty, but when you lose sight of even its beauty, when you're just feeling like something shouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm.
I
That
mean, you can
feels
take that to immigration, right?
right. Well, and I was even thinking too, that actually feels like a good segue. I mean, it's a perfect metaphor for pretty much everything, right? But it feels like a good segue even to talking about aging and women and like,
Mm-hmm.
these different life stages for women and how we miss out
Yeah.
on the beauty. It seems like we're really impoverished in terms of being able to see the beauty of the later life cycles and what aliveness means for female bodies,
Yes.
menstruating bodies, birthing bodies, whatever we want to call them, but bodies that and even that's sort of falls short. Hormonal bodies, all bodies are hormonal, whatever we want to call them. But yeah, these different life cycles and yeah, so I don't know. Does that take you anywhere?
It does. I'm often saddened to think of, for women of every age, from when they start having their period to when their period ends, that there is, there is this ongoing negativity that culturally is expressed in multiple ways. I mean, I remember when my period started, I just wanted to pretend it wasn't happening. There was nothing, there was no ceremony, there was no, it was a hidden, you don't talk about it. My mom had a difficult time ever bringing it up. Therefore, I had a really hard time telling her when my period started. It was a negative thing. When I was growing up, it was called the curse. And you just tolerated it. And same kind of around birth. Like, I had my babies in a different way than most people that I knew. In that day and age, it was under 1% of women who had their babies out of hospital. I feel like if I hadn't had that opportunity, like, I had never heard the word midwife before long, maybe right before I got pregnant. I had a friend who had her babies with a midwife, and it sounded appealing to me because what I'd seen up to that point, I didn't want to have kids. I wanted to have kids, but I didn't want to do that way. So, even around birth, it was all pretty negative. And then any talk of menopause was negative. So, it's just like every part of being a woman was negative. And I mean, we can go to breasts. Your breasts are too small, you should have an augmentation. Your breasts are too large, you should have a reduction. There's like, when can we be satisfied and happy with our bodies? So that makes me sad. And I feel like part of my storytelling, my reason I'm here, is to talk about the positive parts of well, that being a woman is positive, and those things that we hear and take on as negative actually can be reworded and thought of in a positive manner. It's kind of like how I feel about menopause and perimenopause. Women come to me with the same sorts of questions about if they're in perimenopause, when is menopause going to happen, and the same fears around it as they did when I worked with women as they're getting pregnant and having babies. It was very similar energy. And for me, just as an example, one person, I told them how I dealt with hot flashes, and I create teas. So I had a tea that I drank during that time too, just to help balance my hormones. But beyond that, I just wore a lot of tank tops and hoodies, and I would strip the hoodie off and be in the tank top. And, it was just how I coped with it. I didn't find it upsetting. It was more interesting to me to just see my body working like this.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I told this one young woman who was kind of starting to feel anxious about having hot flashes. And she said, you know what? I changed my perspective and they don't bother me at all anymore. And so much is just we're told to be afraid. We're told that it's bad. We're told all these negative things about each step in our reproductive lives and after. And I just don't accept that as the truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, so many do.
Right.
So,
Yeah. What would you say, based at least on your experience, what would you say? Because again, if we're kind of looking at what's the medicine of this moment, like what's the spiritual lesson? I know I hear a lot of women on the other side sort of saying things like, "Oh, I find I just give a lot less of a damn what other people think of me," or oh. But what would you say kind of felt like either the medicine of coming through to the other side, or even the medicine of being in the moment? Because I find myself curious about
mhm.
that part too, because I think that's something people grapple with is like, I hear a lot of women say, like, God, why does this even happen? Right. Or like, or if you're not paying attention and the doctors immediately go, okay, let's put you on HRT, right? Let's put you on hormone replacement therapy. And women are like, oh, okay, like if that'll help. And I ended
Mhm.
up in a conversation with someone the other day, and I think she's been on hormone replacement therapy for 10, 15 years. And I asked her, I said, is there any exit plan from that? Like, I'm just curious,
Yeah.
like, are you planning on taking that till you die? Because it seems like we're supposed to go through this. Like there's a reason our
Yeah.
bodies are supposed to go through this. And the same even with just the idea that like after 30, our body stops producing as much collagen and we actually start having less collagen. And I mean, yes, I get that also there is sort of a somewhat quote unquote downward trajectory, if we want to call it that, in the sense that after a certain age, our bodies are doing more degenerating than building, generally speaking. That is the aging
Mhm.
process.
Yeah.
But still, like, it seems like, what if we assume there's an intelligence to that,
Yeah.
or that there's a purpose to that instead of that it's a sign that something's wrong? And so I guess I'm curious for you, what are some of those? And maybe we just focus on perimenopause or menopause, or maybe you even have a sense of what that is like, sort of at some of these different points in the life. But what do you feel like the intelligence is in those moments? What's been your experience with that?
Well, I don't think we talk about that at all. So we start our periods. Maybe somebody says, well, we have them so that we can eventually have a baby if we want to. But it's just like for me, they called it the curse. You just tried to pretend it wasn't happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll kind of skip over birth because if you're growing a baby, that's either your
Yeah.
goal or accidentally or growing a
Mm-hmm.
baby. And but when we get to perimenopause and menopause, so much like the HRT going on basically until you die. In my mind, so I look at my life and what I want to do for myself and what I would share with others is I start with simple and from the earth. That's I'm going to eat the foods from the earth. I'm going to use the herbs in teas because that is traditionally how it's been done. If I need to increase it because I have some chronic or acute condition, I'll move to tinctures, um, and still keep doing the teas because of all the nutrients that are in them and that there is a purpose that they're there sharing themselves with us to give us the nutrients that we need. Um, so that's where I start. So I look at hormone replacement. So we start with little young girls and we give them birth control pills if they have cramps or their periods are heavy or any excuse. They get on hormones of birth
Mm-hmm.
control.
Mm-hmm.
They get to be, 10 years, 20 years later, they want to have a baby. Well, then they oftentimes have a hard time getting pregnant. There can be an infertility that's just from having taken and had those hormones in their body for all those years. So then they do IVF, and then it just kind of keeps on. Okay, so then you get to be perimenopausal, you have some weird periods, and they say, well, you're let's do some blood work. Your estrogen is too low, your progesterone is too, whatever they come up with. Okay, these are bioavailable, these are better, but that isn't what your body's doing. So again, I would support the liver. I do a liver support tea, especially in the fall and in the spring, because our liver is our organ to help balance our hormones by getting out excess hormones. So I would do that. I have a woman support tea that I would do to try to, because our bodies want to balance themselves. And we would, talk about stress and all of that. But then when we get to menopause itself, being given hormones that you really, when do you get off the hormone wagon? When do you decide you're old enough, you don't need those anymore? I don't know. There was the studies that caused there to be less hormone replacement therapy done because of cancer risks, but now they've come out with new studies saying that that's not really true, so they're back on that bandwagon again. And for some women, if that feels very nourishing and what they want to do, I have no judgment.
Right.
I just want to say there are other options. If that isn't feeling good to you, to be on hormone replacement forever, you don't have to, because your body is made to go through this process of no longer having a period. There may be some symptoms, but part of that can be because of stress.
Mindset.
Just mental health stuff, the foods that we eat, all of that. And you can do things simple and from the earth to try to get that balanced out. And eventually those symptoms go away. We're taught a lot that your tissues get thin and friable. You're not, you're dry, you're old. It was just such a negative bunch of things that were said about going through menopause. I happened to get a divorce right kind of as I was going through menopause. And because it was a pretty toxic relationship, I felt pretty ugly. And one of my daughter's friends got me going on dating apps. And so I dated for 3 years, and I dated a lot of people, and I kept notes and track. And what I came out of it with is that doesn't have to be the case. I felt beautiful again. I felt wet and juicy and healthy and sexy and all of those things that we're told that menopause takes away. And I'm going to just suggest that perhaps it's relationships that we have that cause us to feel dry and unsexy and all of that versus actual physical fact. So, and beyond that, you're no longer worrying about getting pregnant. You don't have the expense or worry about having your period. And oh my gosh, it's so wonderful to not have to worry about those or care about those things anymore. And I understand, hormones change a bit. Testosterone elevates a little more for women. And we do kind of, can we swear on this show?
Go for it.
We don't give a fuck
Yeah.
anymore in a good way.
Yeah.
Like, especially if we've been people pleasers.
Yeah.
It's really a time of coming into your own and knowing that you have this season, whatever length of time, that you can, it's exciting. It's alive. It's like, oh my gosh, now I don't have to take care of all of these people and things, and I can take care of myself and do what I want to do create what I want to create. It just feels like a really creative time.
Yeah.
Now, in my dating world, I did meet some men of my age, and their request in a kind of general overall sense was they were looking for somebody to retire with them. One guy said, sit on the couch, watch games, and hold their hand. And I was like, no thanks. That's not what I'm going to be doing. Like, good on you.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know. And when you talk about like how much our relationships actually leave us feeling dry, and it's like, yeah, I think there is this assumption, even not just for women, but just that like, as and some of that too, I think before we started recording, you kind of asked me like, why do why have I been going to Europe? And, I think for me, some of it, and more specifically, I think Scotland and Ireland, this most recent trip, I really found myself like blessed last fall and early winter. I found myself feeling alive again in a way that I hadn't in a long time here. And some of that can be if we're just I'd kind of taken the pressure off my business. I was kind of working with the clients I already had. I wasn't launching anything new. I wasn't like trying to expand or grow. I wasn't putting any pressure on myself to like perform in any kind of way. I just wanted to kind of wake up in the morning and explore the day and see, like, let kind of the impulses of my body and let sort of this sense of like, what would actually be fun to do today, or what would be pleasurable to do. And so I kind of let that more guide me. And it was funny because at the beginning I was like, I don't even know. Do I even know what brings me pleasure? I was like, I feel like I might have gotten so disconnected from that. I don't even know. So I would just say, okay, well, let's start with something. I think I like hiking, so I'll go for a hike today. And then I'd be like panting my way up some mountain, because I joke that Scotland has not heard of switchbacks. That's like not a concept over there, which, I mean, it makes sense. They have these steep hills. And so you just hack steps into it. And if you're hacking steps into it, you want to go direct and not go back and forth a lot, But anyway, but I'd be panting my way up these hills and I'd be like, is this pleasurable? Like, am I actually having fun? I'm not sure, but I'd be like smiling and I'd be kind of laughing and I'd be enjoying the scenery and my heart would be beating and I'd be like, okay, it's challenging, but I'm alive. And I think that's some of what you're pointing to a little bit here too, is like with some of these like perspective shifts or these mindset kind of shifts, these ways of seeing is, and I have this conversation with another friend a lot, is that we're a really pain avoidant culture. And it makes sense. Like our bodies have developed to like, be like, oh, pain, like that's probably like, don't keep touching the hot thing, like there's a certain amount of that's like a normal survival instinct. But it seems like we've really like leaned into that and elevated that into something that's actually no longer serving us, because again, we now have this hostility towards pain, or this idea that pain means something's wrong. And and there's a distinction between pain that's telling us don't do something and pain that's telling us you might need to shift how you're doing something, or pain that's telling us that isn't actually pain, but is just challenge, that's telling us you might not have the muscle or the lung capacity yet to be easily up to this task, but if you keep going, you'll get there, or whatever it might be. Not all symptoms of perimenopause are necessarily comfortable, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong or they're bad or they're, something we need to be hostile to, or, whatever. Even birth is actually quite painful, So I heard anyway. I haven't been through it myself, but, and again, like many women don't experience it that way necessarily because they have a different relationship with the idea of pain or discomfort, or, I see that in my work with people around emotional stuff, is like, we go through these phases of death and rebirth, and that's part of aliveness. And part of that is like actually being unmade sometimes. I really feel that in my body. Sometimes it's like, I can feel things just unraveling and everything kind of coming undone. And I'm like, okay, I'm goo right now, and it's not particularly comfortable. It's definitely a little scary in the sense that some part of me is like, wants to know what's going to happen next. And is it going to be okay? And, and there is a fear to surrendering and trusting that process and that wisdom. But Um,
And
anyway,
how,
trying to
and
trace it back to how I started, but yeah, go for it.
well, and what you're saying, how much of that is that fear around it or worry around it because we don't live in community where we're daily, minute by minute, running across our sister, our mother, our grandma, our aunt, our neighbor, to have them go, oh, I experienced that. That's not, that's normal. Or you might try these herbs, make a tea, or somebody just makes you a tea and says, here, this will help. And
Mm-hmm.
we're on our own so much.
Yeah. And I think that's where, yeah. So that's why I started sort of talking about these trips. And, I think for me, while there's a certain amount of individualism that's kind of pervaded a lot of, again, quote unquote, white places,
Yeah.
at the same time, I think the US has like elevated that to like a whole other level. There's a lot of our collective identity and collective myth, our like sort of origin story as a country that's really wrapped up in this like the rugged individual frontiersman, like
Mhm.
manifest destiny, pull yourself up by your bootstrap, all of that stuff that we're not wired for
No.
actually. And if you look at nature, nothing exists by itself.
Yeah.
Even trees, they need the mycorrhizal fungi, they need the other trees. So even where they might be slightly in competition with each other, they actually all suffer if there's not enough of the right kinds of competition and the right kinds of stress or challenge or, you know, support. Um, and yeah, and so I don't know, there's something I think for me in some of these places that I can feel some of that more intact within the culture still.
Oh,
And so it helps me feel more alive over there than I think I find myself easily accessing here in the
mhm.
US. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I went with a class from university I was in to Columbia, and we were working with some culture groups that had immigrated, well, not really immigrated because they're within the country, but had moved from the coast where there had been a lot of drug cartel issues, and then they moved into this big city, but they were um, trying to make their way, keeping their culture, yet not having very much money, living in these kind of rougher neighborhoods and that. So we went there to help with our mindset of what that help would look like, but they wanted us to make them a website. So that's what we did. But we were meeting with this one group, and because they spoke Spanish and I did not, anybody who spoke English, they had a translator. So I could watch their faces when what I said was translated. So I really got to see their feelings. And I explained that I was a midwife. Well, in the United States, it's a pretty disparaged role. And I hadn't realized I'd taken on that cultural feeling about it, even though I do it, like I felt lesser than. When they saw what I or heard what I was doing, they got so lit up. They were really excited. And there were people like were Boeing executives and, all these like what I would call, good jobs.
Yeah.
They didn't get that excited about that, but me,
Mm-hmm.
they brought me gifts during the time I was there, because that role meant so much to them.
Yeah.
And I just got to see again, oh yeah, the United States is its own culture, and
Yeah.
it is not how everybody else thinks. And I get locked into that more than I'd like.
Yeah. When I was traveling in India back in, I think that was 2017 with a friend of mine who was probably about 20 some years older than me. So there was like definitely an age gap there. And um and it was fascinating traveling around and seeing, and she would get so frustrated because when we'd be in restaurants together, the servers would all address me and she'd be like, what am I, invisible? And I'm like, actually, I think here that's a sign of respect, because I think she'd so internalized how much people, older people, become invisible in this country,
Yes.
and I was even sort of noticing it on my last trip. It was like I would be walking around and like in the past, I'd have to worry about, I mean, not worry, but I would have to deal with maybe getting catcalled or getting, oh, like woman on her own standing out, like, and I noticed like people would just walk into me, like they literally wouldn't see me. And I was like, okay, I don't have to worry about that anymore, I guess. Like it was fascinating. So anyway, but so she was, so she was sort of so programmed to be so sensitive to feeling invisible. And I was like, I actually think in this culture, that's a sign of respect. They're not going to address you. They're going to address the one who is more the caretaker or the helper or the, you kind of address the staff sort of. And like, because I'm the younger one, I'm kind of the staff to you, even though we're friends and, and maybe that wasn't all of what was happening, but I think it was a little bit more that, and I said that to her one time and she was like, oh, and it did, like, it was just, and then it was fascinating too, because she'd worked for most of her life as a nurse. And at the time I was mostly teaching yoga and meditation. And she would be like, oh, I'm a nurse. And people would be like, oh, okay. And then they'd ask me and I'd say, oh, I teach yoga and meditation. Oh, and they'd like all want to talk to me about that, and again, some of that's cultural because it was India and, obviously yoga originated there, but, and also has kind of, interestingly, I mean, through colonialism, kind of got lost there, got taken abroad, and then is kind of now being imported back in, which is its own sort of complicated, complicated thing. But it was, and I noticed she was kind of getting, she was not used to like a nurse being sort of treated with less enthusiasm perhaps than a yoga teacher, right? Or whatever. And it was just fascinating. It's so interesting to just see, to see cultural priorities, and and there's something to be said, for living in places where the culture, where we're kind of living counterculturally and really trying to hold that stance, and then there's also something we said though, for the loneliness and the toll that can take on us, especially if we don't feel like we have the community or we don't, because I see that a lot with clients, like as they start to, because when you were talking about the plants, for example, and we were talking about animism and kind of that shift, that disconnect in our ancestral roots, and then kind of that shift from thinking of things in the way that our brains have been trained to think about things because of our culture and the wounded cultural disconnects, and then kind of slowly shifting to something that's more aligned with aliveness, that's a little bit more aligned with like rhythm and flow and 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 so I see that a lot with clients, that as they start working with me, it's like, because just working on sort of that more energetic or quote unquote shamanic level requires a paradigm shift, actually, if we're like really going to engage with it properly, for those of us who've been raised in cultures where that's not, where that is a countercultural kind of thing. And they start to feel a little lonely, like as they start to make that shift, because it does, their relationships start to feel drier, or sort of like, that as that aliveness is coming back for them, they're like looking around going like, oh, like, where do I start to find other people who also, and I don't know, does that take you anywhere? Because I feel like that's just such a thing in like that loneliness in these times.
I think there is a benefit to the loneliness. So I realized that I use busyness as a coping mechanism for so many years. Like I just kept adding on more things, like more roles, and it was how I coped with being in a toxic relationship for decades and decades. And leaving that, I was starting to strip away that busyness a little bit. And then COVID came, and it just, like, most people were really bummed about COVID, but it served its purpose for me to be kind of housebound and to realize how much that solitude was useful. I saw some meme recently that talked about the butter or the caterpillar being alone and,
Mm,
before it becomes the
mm,
butterfly, and that
mm,
that there is in nature this oftentimes this time, I guess, like of death before of rebirth.
mhm,
And so now after COVID continued that process because I was working remotely, and it just was really good. And I know I had family members who were concerned, like I wasn't getting outside enough, or not
mm.
outside, but like around people enough.
Around people.
It's just not the time right now. And
Mm,
now it's blossoming again with this new season of my life of the work that I'm doing, where I'm having a lot of contact with people on a really regular, new people on a regular basis that are, that we get to share storytelling that are nourishing to me, and I
mhm,
trust I'm nourishing to them. And yeah, so I don't
mhm.
know if that had anything to do with what you said, but
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, again, because I think it points, and I think some of this might be because, again, I feel very sensitive, like I shared earlier, about to rhythm and to kind of timing of
Mhm.
things. And I think that, is part of my medicine, most likely. um, but how much aliveness is actually a rhythm. And there are
Yes.
times of like, yeah, going inward and
Hmm.
reevaluating. And you're right. I think there is a time and a place for the loneliness. And then,
Hmm.
um,
And then I think the loneliness becomes aloneness, because
mm,
loneliness speaks to me anyway of feeling like it's something I shouldn't feel, like
mm,
I want to fix it.
mm-hmm,
But in aloneness, just solitude feels really good.
yeah,
And it could be interpreted, again, it's that perspective, like
mm-hmm,
what is your perspective? Is it negative? Now, for me, aloneness has been, I had, kids and businesses, and I was never alone. And to have this time of aloneness, even prior to COVID, when I traveled, I pretty much always traveled alone. And
that's my
it was,
preference.
yeah, it was really
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. I think too, some of that points to like also then, yeah, can we trust ourselves to know when we need to go inward and when we're actually then hungry for something and it's time to like, because I know, yeah, I've become quite comfortable with solitude and aloneness. And then there are days where I'm like, why am I so like feeling so empty? And it's like, okay, maybe you need to talk to somebody today.
Yeah.
Like, we could probably handle this with a chat with a friend, and so it's, yeah, I think it's just finding that, and for each person that's going to be different what that rhythm is, and then even in different seasons of our lives it's going to be different.
And maybe that's what's scary about the different seasons of our reproductive lives. If we go to the doctor and they can give us stuff, we can go to have a baby and they give us stuff so we don't have to feel. And menopause, we could do, hormone replacement, take stuff for sleep, don't have to feel. We don't feel that aloneness,
mm,
which could feel lonely in going through the process. Like there
yeah.
is there advantage to going through a process like that,
Mm,
where you trust your body,
mhm.
you trust your intuition to tell you what's next steps. I mean, if you need to go to the doctor, you go to the doctor.
Right.
But can we trust ourselves and trust our bodies?
And I think there's also a certain level of like self-responsibility that
Mhm.
actually asks of us too, that I actually think many of us are terrified of, partly because we live in a culture that doesn't have rites of passage. And so
Right.
many of us actually, it's like the version of us that's mostly behind the wheel is actually a young version of us that really was forced to kind of take too much responsibility too
Mhm.
young. And then balks at taking any responsibility from there on out, or doesn't feel up to the task because it actually literally isn't, because it's sort of this immature part of us that hasn't
Mhm.
actually matured, that hasn't actually developed. It's that difference, I think, between aging and like becoming an elder. It's like
Mhm.
that's actually a distinction. Like, just because, like you were saying, just because our body goes through these things doesn't necessarily mean we're engaging with it
Right.
for the medicine of the moment, the spiritual lesson of the moment, you know, the perspective shift of the moment, the deeper meaning and
Mhm.
juice of the moment.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, that feels like a beautiful place to start to wrap. How are you feeling? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Is there anything else you kind of feel like you feel called to share, or to close it out? Or is there anything too, about your business, or where people can find you if they want to work with you, or anything like that? That it's funny, we've had such a just lovely conversational moment, and then to like sort of bring that in, I'm like, whoa, that feels kind of jarring. But your links will all be in the show notes, so people can
Okay.
certainly find you there. But if there's anything else you want to say, I'd love to give you that space. And then, or even if it's just something, unrelated to that you just feel like you want to kind of close us out with, then yeah.
Yeah, anybody can find me in those links. They can email me off my website. I'm happy to talk on my, about anything. And I have space where we can have like a couple hours to talk if somebody has questions they want to ask or anything like that, that they can just sign up on my website. So it's all very easy.
Nice.
Um, I guess I keep hearing the word trust,
Mm,
trusting the processes, trusting our bodies,
mm,
um, trusting our gut, our intuition, our spirit to tell us what we need to do next, and that our best is always in mind
mm,
from the spiritual world. I totally believe that if we really listen, I thought it was really good advice when somebody said, how do you tell if it's like the spiritual world talking to you, whether you call it guides or God or the
mm,
universe? And are you hearing something you would tell yourself? Like, we tend to be really negative towards ourselves. Oh, I was dumb. I didn't get that. I didn't do that. Or, really looking at the downside of us. But if we're hearing loving thoughts and uplifting things, and that you're doing well, and all that is
mm,
that realm talking to us. And we deserve to hear that and believe it and trust ourselves.
mm. I love that. Thank you. Yeah, that's a perfect place to end. So thank you. Yeah, so much for being here
It
and
was a
for this
great conversation. Now
conversation.
I want to travel with you, so let me know.
Oh, yeah. We should totally that would be amazing. Um, yeah, and obviously I feel like maybe it could even have you back sometime. Certainly I would love to chat with you sometime even outside of this context, but yeah, have you back sometime too, because I mean, I just think there's always more we can say. And and I think, as you're saying, I think that's some of my hope for some of these conversations, is that these become places people can turn to when they're feeling that lack of community, or when they're in that point where they're like, I have a question about this and
Mhm.
I can't turn to the aunties and the grandmas and the moms and or the healthy masculine figures, the uncles and the dads and the,
Yeah.
grandfathers and yeah, where do we turn to when we actually are missing these types of conversations that I think
Mhm.
our ancestors probably did have a lot, and they,
Yeah.
maybe not in the same way, because they maybe didn't have some of the same cultural challenges that I think we face in these modern times. But yeah, the gathering around the fire and being like, what's actually going on here? What
Yeah.
are we doing, and how do we stay human, and how do we stay alive and like be alive, not just like survive, you know?
Right.
Um, yeah. So thank you, Tammy. This
You're
was
welcome. It was
lovely.
so good to talk to you.
Yeah, you as well. And so yeah, for everybody listening, thank you so much for joining and let us know how the conversation was for you. Both of us, I'm sure, would love to hear from anybody listening who wants to kind of keep the conversation going in whatever way.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we'll go ahead and blow out the candle for now. And oops, spilled wax everywhere. That's fun. All right. On that note, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.